Hi you guys, it's Mrs. Behrens. I have your science investigation for today that focuses on chemical weathering. The materials you will need are your science notebook, a pencil, and from your Digital Academy science kit, you will need vinegar, 4 vials with lids, sticky notes, limestone, sandstone, basalt, and marble, and your hand lens. Today our learning targets are: I can explain what a chemical reaction is. I can explain how rocks are affected by acid rain. I can make observations and describe what happens in an experiment. And I can explain how chemical weathering is connected to landform formation. Before getting started, you should have already completed the entry in your science notebook today. You listed the questions, the materials, the word bank, and the table that we will be filling out that looks like this. Next, I'm going to walk you through the materials you should have. You should have 4 vials full of vinegar, your sticky notes, and 4 different rocks: sandstone, limestone, marble, and basalt. Those are all labeled on the bags. And lastly, take your hand lens out in case you would like to use it. The focus of our lab today is looking at how acid rain impacts rocks. The reason this is connected to chemical weathering is because acid rain, which will be demonstrated using vinegar here, is what causes chemical weathering. Acid rain can cause a chemical reaction in rocks that breaks down the rocks into smaller pieces, weathering, and leads to the breakdown of those materials. In order to investigate the impact of acid rain on these rocks, we are going to be using vinegar to imitate the acid rain, and we are going to see what impact the vinegar, or acid rain, has on sandstone, limestone, marble, and basalt. Before seeing the impact of the acid rain, we need to take a look at each of these 4 rocks prior to putting them in the vinegar. That way that we can make our observations and make sure we understand what the rock looked like before the acid rain, so that we can notice if there is any change or not. At this time, I'm going to have you start with basalt. Take your sample of basalt out of the Ziploc bag and explore it. Look at the sample that you have. Notice its size, its texture, its color. Notice how it feels in your fingers when you rub your fingers over the rock. Notice how heavy it is, if it's scratchy or smooth, if it's all one color or if it has many colors. All of these things are characteristics of the rock that we are going to look at when making observations before vinegar. Now we're going to fill in our first box on the table for basalt and what we notice for the observations that we have made before the vinegar, or before the acid rain. I notice that it is dark gray, smooth, and bumpy. And has small white specks. Those are the observations that I have made of this rock, basalt, before putting it in the acid rain, or the vinegar. Now our next step will be to take this sample of basalt and submerge it in a vial of vinegar to represent the acid rain. You will take out one of your vinegar vials. Again, be careful with these. Make sure that you are not spilling the vinegar anywhere in your house or in your apartment, wherever you are living. Vinegar doesn't smell very good, so you don't want it spilling all over. Before putting this rock sample into the vinegar to see what happens when acid rain comes in contact with basalt, let's talk about what we will be looking for. The process that causes chemical weathering is something called a chemical reaction. That is one of the words, well, it's actually two words, in your word bank for this lesson. A chemical reaction is a process in which two or more materials mix in a way that forms new materials. In this case, we will be looking at vinegar as one material and basalt as another material. Now the question is, how will we know if a chemical reaction is occurring or not? Typically, when acid rain comes in contact with a rock and a chemical reaction happens, it forms a gas. So if you think about what might happen if there is a gas being formed inside of a liquid, think about that for a second. If a gas is formed inside of a liquid, what would we see? If you were thinking bubbles, you are correct. If we place this rock sample into the vinegar and we see a lot of bubbles coming off of the rock, that means that there is a chemical reaction happening. Are we ready to try it? Here we go. I'm going to carefully take the cap off of my vial, and I'm going to drop the basalt into the vinegar. Now we'll give it just a second. Hopefully you can get a clear view of what I'm seeing inside there. What do you notice? I notice, if you look very closely, that there are some teeny tiny bubbles coming off of this rock. There's not a lot of them. They're not very noticeable, but I can see some. Now, is it possible that there could be air trapped inside the rock that might give off bubbles as well? Yes, that is possible. It's our job to decide, based on what we observe, if we think it is a chemical reaction or if they are air bubbles coming out of the rock. Now, if you look at this even closer, what do you notice about what has happened with the bubbles? Are they still coming off of the rock? I see just a couple on the left-hand side, but it looks to me like most of the bubbles have stopped. What does that tell you about whether it is a chemical reaction or if they were air bubbles? My prediction is that they are air bubbles, because I think if the rock basalt, if the whole rock was still reacting to the vinegar, that we would probably still be seeing lots and lots of bubbles, and I don't really see very many anymore. All right. So I am going to set this off to the side for now, and I'm going to make some notes about what I observed when I put basalt in vinegar or acid rain. I noticed there were tiny bubbles at first, but then they slowed down. The final column in your table says, "Is this rock weathered by acid rain?" Now remember, what has to happen between the acid rain and the rock in order for the rock to be weathered by acid rain, to go through chemical weathering? What has to happen? Think about that for a second. You are right. There has to be a chemical reaction that happens between the acid rain and the rock in order for it to be chemically weathered. I don't think that there was a chemical reaction happening between basalt and vinegar because the bubbles stopped. So my prediction is this rock weathered by acid rain? I'm going to guess no. It is not weathered by acid rain. If acid rain falls on basalt, there might be some air bubbles that come out, but I don't think there's a chemical reaction happening. After you have completed making your observations of basalt in vinegar, feel free to leave that in the vinegar. If you would like to continue observing, you can set it off to the side. And we will set you up for the final 3. Your job to finish this investigation is to go through the same steps with marble, limestone, and sandstone. You will be answering the same 3 questions for all 3 of these rock samples. What do you observe before the vinegar? What do you observe in the vinegar? And is this rock weathered by acid rain? Are you observing a chemical reaction? After you have finished filling in all of the columns on your table for all 3 of the rock samples, take a picture of both pages of your science notebook and submit it to Schoology.